Chautauqua. It's a great pleasure to welcome you on this lovely afternoon to the Hall of Philosophy. We at Chautauqua Institution are delighted to be co-sponsors, and in this instance, hosts for yet another program with the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. My function today is simply to welcome you and to present our good friend and my colleague, John Barrett, who is the Linnaeus Fellow at the Jackson Center in Jamestown, who's a professor at the St. John's University School of Law, and the editor of the book That Man, which was Robert Jackson's memoir of FDR. John?
Thank you very much, Dick, and all of you. It's good to be back here at Chautauqua and to see so many friends. Until I first had the privilege 3 years ago of speaking from this podium, I didn't know I was a Chautauquan, and I certainly am now. Part of the great pleasure of today and getting to introduce my friend Dick Sonnenfeldt is I'm getting to watch him discover that he too is a Chautauquan. My introduction will be very brief because the man you want to hear from is Richard Sonnenfeldt. He was born in 1923 in Berlin. He grew up in a small village northeast of Berlin in what post-war became East Germany. But he lived there as a young German Jew in the 20s and into the 30s as the circumstances of his whole world changed. His parents, both physicians, over time, as a function of the Nuremberg laws, were prohibited from practicing their profession. Their economic circumstances and their physical safety began to deteriorate. And as so many parents worked to do in those circumstances, they looked at the most precious things in their lives, their two young sons, and figured out in time a way to get the sons out of Germany. As a teenager, Richard Sonnenfeldt and his younger brother Helmut became boarding students at a school in Kent, England. And Richard Sonnenfeldt was there when Germany went to war against England in the late 1930s. At that point, he was a German in England. In other words, an enemy alien. And thus, he was interned by the United Kingdom. As an enemy alien and a suspect foreign national, he was put in a transport capacity and shipped to Australia. From Australia, he sort of talked his way into a visa, and by the way, his parents independently and miraculously had succeeded in getting from Germany to, I believe, Switzerland, to Baltimore, and survived, and themselves got out. And that fact allowed Richard Sonnenfeldt to negotiate his way out of prisoner status and into visa applicant status because he had people in Baltimore and they had American sponsors. A long journey then went from Australia to India, to South America, to Cuba, and ultimately to Baltimore. All of which is the sojourn of a boy who is not yet 20 years old, somebody whose education had stopped at the 10th grade when all these travails and travels began. Richard Sonnenfeldt came of age and briefly began studies in America, but registered with the Selective Service, and his number was called. And having become an American citizen in that meantime, he became an American soldier. And he was in France, and he fought with the U.S. Army in 1944 and into 1945. And as the war came to an end in the spring of 1945, he became a worker in a motor pool and was called to do some interpretation for a high-ranking general because he was, of course, a native German speaker, and as a quick teenage study had quickly picked up good English in England and I think idiomatic American English in Baltimore. One thing leads to another, and he becomes, during that 1945-1946 year, the chief American interpreter for the American prosecution in Nuremberg, Germany. He is one of the only people in that time period who literally played a role in questioning the 22 principal Nazis who became the defendants in that trial. His life story continues, and some of it is in the Daily article this morning. But what he's going to talk to us about today is that experience, those people, and the perspective it has given him in the life he's led since and what it connects to in today's issues. I'm delighted to introduce my friend, the chief American interpreter at Nuremberg, Richard Sonnenfeldt.
I was told that this afternoon I would have the greatest audience ever, and I can already tell that that's true. Dick, thank you so much for the great honor of letting me be here. And Greg Peterson, Greg is over there as the co-sponsor. And John, my good friend and neighbor. I am honored to be invited to speak here, near the home, the one-time home of Robert Jackson, at a place that hosted Franklin Roosevelt and many other U.S. presidents. And today, we're just 1 year away from the 60th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials. And I remember, and I'm sure many of you remember, that Franklin Roosevelt rejected suggestions from Stalin and Churchill just to shoot the principal Nazis, while Robert Jackson insisted that those Nazis be given a fair trial. And what could be more fitting for me than to be introduced by Professor John Barrett, who is the distinguished editor of Jackson's biography of Roosevelt. And John's own writings will soon enhance the memory of Jackson and the Nuremberg trials. John, I'm honored and grateful to have you as my friend, and once more, I thank you.
Thank you.
The great philosopher George Santayana said that those who do not remember history are destined to repeat it. And it has also been said by someone, and I don't know who, that history teaches only, that people don't learn from history. And today I will try my best to address both of those propositions. To launch ethnic cleansing or aggressive wars, Hitler, Milosevic, and Saddam had to subjugate their own nations first. And therefore, I will start by telling you how I experienced the subjugation of Germany, which was essential to Hitler's blitzkrieg, the extermination of the Jews, and of course his later defeat, which led to the Nuremberg trials. So bear with me for a few minutes. I was born in 1923 as Heinz Wolfgang Richard Sonnenfeldt into a Jewish family that had been German citizens since before the year 1800. And I was raised to be a good German boy like you were raised to be good Americans. My father was a country doctor. He had been a medical officer in the Kaiser's army in World War I, and his uniform from that war hung in the closet, periodically cleaned and pressed and ready to wear again. Both of my parents were doctors, and they believed in selflessness, integrity, and charity, and the Ten Commandments. But as a child in that little town where I grew up, I heard over and over that Germany had been cheated of victory in World War I by traitors that had stabbed the glorious Imperial German army in the back and then signed the humiliating Versailles Treaty. And only at Nuremberg in 1945 did I see proof that the Kaiser's generals had in fact capitulated to forestall an imminent military conquest of Germany. But Hitler and other extreme radical writers preached that the lost war in Versailles, the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, were the work of communists and Jewish traitors. Well, I grew up in a republic. Our culture was really based on unquestioning obedience to government authority. Listen to what Bethmann Hollweg, the last Kaiser's last chancellor, said in 1913. The prime duty of every citizen, and he really meant subjects, is obedience to the state. In 1919, the Kaiser abdicated, Germany became a republic, but the century-old German habit of obedience to the state was hardly dented at all. And in the 1920s, the Great Depression hit, reparations paying Germany even harder than the rest of the world, while Nazis and communists battled each other in the streets for control of the government and the country. But neither party had a majority. One unstable coalition government followed the next. And Hitler's mouthpiece, Joseph Goebbels, I don't know whether you remember that name, the Minister of Propaganda, he wrote, "We sit in the Reichstag, the German parliament, to arm ourselves with the weapons of democracy from its own arsenal in order to destroy it. We shall go down in history as the greatest statesmen of all time or the greatest criminals." Now, how about that for foresight? In 1932, the Nazis had 35% of the popular vote, while rapidly growing communist votes stoked middle-class fears of a Bolshevik takeover. And on January the 30th, 1933, when I was not quite 10 years old, Hindenburg, the non-executive president of Germany, appointed Hitler to be prime minister of a minority government with only 2 members. And one of those 2 members was Hermann Goering, about whom I will talk at some length later. But he controlled the police, and that included the Gestapo. But moderates, like my parents, believed that Hitler, like his predecessors, would soon fail. But that was not to be. 3 weeks after Hitler's appointment, the empty Reichstag, the German parliament building, was set on fire. And the Nazis convinced President Hindenburg that this was evidence of a communist insurrection. And Hindenburg then, and this may sound unbelievable to you, invoked a provision of the German democratic constitution that gave Hitler emergency executive powers. It was in fact a self-destruct clause of the so-called Weimar Constitution, and German presidents had used it numerous times previously to enable beleaguered German governments to deal with strikes, floods, or to restore public order. But Hitler used these extraordinary powers to arrest his political opponents and to bar the courts from reviewing his actions. He then had Parliament, now totally denuded of opposition, vote him unrestricted, permanent power. And that's how Hitler became a dictator under a legal cloak, and that's how he conquered Germany. And at age 10, I knew not what had happened, and no adult told me that Hitler had conquered Germany. That was in 1933. And Germans who resented the Versailles Treaty had experienced only one 14-year one 14-year interlude of democracy, which was marked by dreadful inflation and horrendous unemployment. But they did remember better times under authoritarian government, and they were totally ready to try it again. And again, I quote Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, who wrote in his diary, "We wanted to acquire power legally." What he really meant is hoodwink the German people. But we had no intention whatsoever to use power legally once we had it. What a plan and what a success. Hitler then put the unemployed back to work with deficit financing. And when Hindenburg, the president, died in August of 1934, Hitler had his cabinet, now dominated by Nazis, simply abolish the presidency and appoint himself head of state and supreme commander of the armed forces. The military, along with civil servants and the judiciary, had to swear loyalty to his person. Nobody even remembered that Germany had a constitution. And next, Hitler staged a popular referendum with nobody on the ballot but himself, where Germans could vote yes or no to his programs, while his goons checked pre-marked ballots to punish those few rare daredevil dissidents. And months later, Germans went wild with enthusiasm when Hitler, ignoring the advice of his generals, ordered 2 lightly armed battalions to march into the demilitarized Rhineland, in fact, scrapping the Versailles Treaty. And France and England, which had won World War I, which then had 10 times his military power, merely twiddled their thumbs and thus made Hitler a hero to Germany. And I have to tell you that even we Jews rejoiced at this restoration of German pride. And Hitler was now in a position to replace the old line generals with toadies. Until September 15, 1935, for almost 2 years, anti-Semitism to us had been mostly verbal abuse. But then the so-called Nuremberg laws terminated the civil rights of Jews, and then we finally knew that we had to leave Germany. And I've been asked, why did so many Jews in Germany to stay in Germany to be slaughtered? They believed far too long that each Nazi chicanery was the last, just as France and England believed that each of Hitler's foreign policy demands was his last. And not for years later was it clear that each of his last ever demands was only a prelude to the next ultimatum. Of Germany after 1936, Robert Jackson said, it's in his closing remarks at the Nuremberg trials, the German people were in the hands of the police. The police were in the hands of the Nazi Party, and it was run by a ring of evil men. Of course, we Jews were desperate to leave Germany then, but in 1937, the Roosevelt administration suddenly and inexorably suspended all immigration of German Jews to America, and now we had no place to go. That was when my parents contemplated, but obviously did not execute, a family suicide. Miraculously, in 1938, our mother obtained scholarships for my brother and me in England. And fortunately, as John already mentioned, my parents were able to escape to the United States after the start of the war in Europe. And then only a trickle of American visas was needed. The multitudes that had desperately wanted to flee the Nazis were now trapped in Europe by the war. They didn't know it, but they were destined for extermination. And in 1940, after Hitler's armies had achieved spectacular victories over Poland, Scandinavia, and Western Europe, Germans believed that they were headed for utopia, never suspecting that they were in fact aboard a Titanic. As already explained, I went to England, was interned, traveled more than halfway around the world, and reached New York in April of 1941 when I was 17. How I got there is a long story, but let me tell you, no one ever stood more happily in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty than I. And 3 years later, I was an American citizen, then became a U.S. Army reconnaissance scout, and fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and then across Germany all the way to Salzburg in Austria. On the way, I was absolutely shattered by a stop at the concentration camp at Dachau, mere minutes after the SS guards had fled. I saw inmates there die before my eyes because they were too weak to tolerate, to survive the joy of liberation. Nothing but that sight could have made my own fortune clearer to me. In August 1945, shortly after the war ended, OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, then organizing for the Nuremberg trials, appointed me chief interpreter for the American prosecution at the Nuremberg trials. And let me just spend a minute and make sure you understand the difference between being an interpreter for the prosecution and an interpreter in court. I was not an interpreter in court. I worked for the prosecution while we examined witnesses in order to determine which ones would become defendants. So this was before the trial, and actually it was a short window of only about 8 or 9 weeks between August and October the 20th, when it was possible to examine these future defendants. But let me return for a minute to my arrival in Nuremberg. Like many German cities of its size, it was a maze of narrow, twisting lanes between mountains of rubble that had been houses. There was a stench of dead bodies mixed with the acrid odor of burnt-out fires, and there was a reek of cordite. And elsewhere in Europe, unbelievably, almost 50 million human beings lay dead. Russians, most of the Jews of Europe, slave laborers, yes, and also almost 10 million Germans, soldiers and civilians. Germany? There was no Germany. Germany had no government, no courts, no operative German law. The victorious Allies created the so-called Control Council, and it assumed all executive, judicial, and legislative powers over Germany. And I, at Nuremberg, a private first class, 22 years old, an immigrant with only a 10th grade education, but fluently bilingual, was appointed chief interpreter for the American prosecution. And I headed a staff of over a dozen interpreters and almost 40 stenographers and typists. And in this window which I've described to you, window of time, we produced more than 10,000 pages of sworn pre-trial testimony for which the commanding general of U.S. forces in Europe later cited me. Now, in what country except America could something like that happen to an uneducated young Jewish immigrant? But let me talk now about Hitler's closest associates. I started with my life and my experience in Germany to give you some idea how they got to Nuremberg. And let me start with Goering, who was Hitler's designated successor, who had the unique rank of Reichsmarschall. And that meant he was a 6-star general, and I defy you to find another man who would ever obtain 6-star rank. Goering was a World War I fighter ace. In fact, he was the successor of the famed Red Baron. He had a genial personality. That and the jolly mirth of the Fat Man were perfect covers for his satanic initiatives, like heading the terror-wielding Gestapo and acting as the de facto chief operating officer under warband, hateful CEO Hitler. I spent hundreds of hours with Goering, interpreting pre-trial depositions and occasionally interrogating him myself. Goering, an inveterate braggart, now aspired to be the Führer, the leader of the defendants at Nuremberg. Let me diverge, if I may, for just a moment. The national press, specifically the Washington Post, reported recently on the interrogations of Saddam Hussein by CIA and FBI operators. And their report was, the problem is that interrogators like to gain the confidence of the interrogatee, or whatever he's called. And the way you do that is to get him to talk about things he's comfortable talking about. But apparently Saddam wasn't comfortable about anything because he didn't talk. Now, my boss at Nuremberg, the chief interrogator, was Colonel John Holland Amon. And he was famous as the prosecutor of Murder Incorporated, a gang of Brooklyn thugs who killed for pay. And Amon really would have thought it quaint to try and make Goering comfortable. When he heard Goering introducing himself as Reichsmarschall, he said to the stenographer, "Record that witness Goering is present." And then Amon noticed, and I have to say it was my nature then, that I was somewhat polite to Goering. And he whispered to me and he said, "Don't do that." And he told me not to let Goering interrupt me. And at the first opportunity that I had, I did it, because I remembered an old German joke where it was shown as a resplendent fat man with a funny name. And I said to him, not Herr Goering, but Herr Gering. And the word Gering in German means a little nothing, paltry. And at that point, he sort of barked. And I offered him a deal. And I said, if you don't interrupt me again, I won't call you Göring again. So we had an understanding, and after a while, it proved a little embarrassing to me because I'd made my mark with him, and he always wanted to speak only through me. And I really didn't know whether to be pleased or insulted to be the favorite of this monster. Now, Eamon never asked Göring a question to which he didn't know the answer. For instance, he had Göring deny any responsibility for the Holocaust. But then he had me shove Göring's own signed order to institute the final solution of the Jewish question. That was the Nazi bureaucraties, the vernacular for the Holocaust, under Göring's nose. And the only question was that your signature? And Göring says, it seems like it. And Göring went on to the next question. Göring also disclaimed any authority over concentration camps until we discovered that when requested, Hermann had repeatedly ordered the release of inmates befriended by his little brother Albert, who was a true humanitarian. Hermann Göring, was an inveterate show-off, and his little brother knew just how to play him. And after that, Göring's denials of authority over concentration camp commandants became a laughingstock. Just one more little Göring story. After jealous rivals claimed that Göring had appointed a man with a Jewish father to head the Luftwaffe, and that was a Nazi no-no if there ever was one, Göring had the Gestapo fake proof that his favorite was the out-of-wedlock son of an Aryan father, and therefore no problem with being Jewish. And Göring then gleefully proclaimed, and I reminded him of it, it is I who decides who is a Jew. And at that he beamed, and he slapped his thighs as I reminded him of this episode, until Eamon, the interrogator, pointed out to him that it just shows how much authority he really had. Once I talked with Göring with only a guard present during reconstruction blasting work, which was used to rebuild the courthouse, and a crack opened and spread in the wall to my right. And at that moment, I saw a look of absolutely undisguised triumph on Göring's face, and I swear I could read his mind. He was composing a headline, and it said, Reichsmarschall Göring, the German war hero, was today buried in the rubble of a vengeful, collapsing courthouse while facing his Jewish accuser. But the crack stopped growing, and then I smiled and he didn't. And he fantasized that in another 30 years, Germans would build a marble mausoleum for him. And he said, my body won't be in it, but that doesn't matter because Napoleon's body is not in his tomb either. No, Göring never offered any repentance or regret or any insight. Now consider briefly Defendant Frank, no relation to the Jewish family of Anne Frank. Before he became the murderous governor of Poland, infamous for its extermination camps, he was the Nazis' top legal officer. And in 1934 he said, previously, when we had a decision to make, we had to ask, what does the law say we should do? But now we only ask, what does the Führer want us to do? Have you ever heard a better description of the rule of man versus the rule of law? On October the 19th, 1945, I was asked, do you solemnly swear that you will truly translate the conversations to be held between Major Neve of the International Military Tribunal and the defendants regarding the indictments to be served upon them today? And I said, I do. It was then 7 years and 1 month since my parents had sent me to England to save my life. A guard brought each one of the defendants out of his prison cell to a small table where Neve and I sat. And invisibly, beside the accused, stood the ghosts of Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels, who had committed suicide. And with me, invisibly, stood the millions upon millions of their dead victims for whom we now spoke. To each of the accused, I read in German, you're charged with crimes against the peace, war crimes, conspiracy to commit aggression, crimes against humanity. I saw no blood on their hands, no evil stares, no murderous animal fangs, no reassuring signs of insanity. And the apparent normality of these men was frightening. Yes, so frightening, because I wondered, would there ever be another gang like them, anywhere, anytime? Justice Jackson, the American prosecutor, had said the evidence on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. And prosecutors did not need the testimony of their foes, nor confessions from the accused to convict them. Documents, dozens, hundreds of documents, with their signatures upon them, were the proof of what the Nuremberg defendants had done. Though I must say that additional testimony from witnesses added to their guilt and to their conviction. I will take just a minute to talk about an actual perpetrator of genocide. The man I've talked about so far, the man who gave the orders. I'm going to talk for just a minute about Rudolf Höss, not to be confused with Hess. Rudolf Höss was the commandant of Auschwitz. And just about the first question I asked him was, Herr Höss, is it true that you exterminated 3.5 million human beings in Auschwitz? And he was almost angry. He said, that's not true. It was only 2.5 million. The others, we didn't exterminate. And I said, how did they die? Well, it was from hunger and illness. Only 2.5 million. I will tell you briefly that once Höss caught some of his own guards stealing gold that had been extracted from the teeth of the inmates. And he punished them, and he sent them to a special concentration camp for SS men. And I said to Höss, did it ever occur to you to steal some of the possessions of the inmates? And he said to me in German, für was halten Sie mich? What kind of a man do you think I am? At Nuremberg, 10 defendants were sentenced to hang, 7 were sent to prison, and 3 were exonerated. While new international law was pioneered at Nuremberg, without a doubt, the trial, the law, and the procedures were largely confirmed by the General Assembly of the United Nations, which came as close to being a reviewing authority as you could on December the 11th, 1946, for those of you who want to look it up, by Resolution I-95. Historians still debate whether Hitler unleashed the Holocaust by seducing and entrapping a resentful and obedient German people to become his accessories, or whether he merely activated long-held hatreds to kill millions of Jews and others. We need not debate these theories to see that Hitler proceeded one step at a time to take away the freedom of the German people before he launched aggressive war, the Holocaust and murder of other millions. Listen once more to diarist Joseph Goebbels. Our domestic foes never saw that our passive legality was just a trick. No. They let us pass through the danger zone. And that's exactly how it was in foreign policy, too. In 1933, a French prime minister ought to have said, and if I had been the French prime minister, I would have said it, the new Reich Chancellor, Hitler, is that man who wrote the book Mein Kampf. This man cannot be tolerated in our vicinity. Either he disappears or we march. But instead, said Goebbels, they left us alone. And when we were done and armed better than they, then they declared war on us. And because Hitler was appeased early on, it later took millions of lives to stop him. And yet, to knock down a foreign tyrant early, to prevent worse later, makes us face the specter, the dilemma, and the awful question of preventive or preemptive war. What have I learned? That it's silly to hope that despots will ever regard goodwill from their enemies as anything other than weakness. I've learned another thing, that trials like those at Nuremberg, and the one presumably ahead for Saddam, are not only legal procedures, but epic events on the stage of world public opinion for us to learn from history. Prosecutors and judges must expose the truth beyond any common sense doubt. At Nuremberg was bared the undeniable history of the Nazi empire of evil. At Saddam's trial, the history of his evil empire, the murder of his fellow citizens, the truth about his weapons, must all become crystal clear, even on Arab television. For ourselves, we must never, never let the power of the people and the majesty of the law be usurped by bigots and charlatans. When freedom and justice are attacked, it is a crime to be passive and silent. When I worked at Nuremberg, I wanted to be the servant of justice, not the handmaiden of hate like a Nazi. I hoped that Nuremberg was the beginning of world law that would tether tyrants. Well, Nuremberg was a beginning, but we have a long way to go. And today, and here, and then, I hoped that all innocent humans should be brothers and sisters in a human family that includes everyone except those who choose to exclude themselves. I belong to that human family, and I hope you do too. Thank you.
Mr. Sonnenfeldt welcomes questions, and I will help him field them.
Good afternoon. My name is Herman Wygotsky. I'm a physician. I was the Deputy Director of Research in the Air Forces in World War II, and later the Chief of Research at the School of Aviation Medicine. Unfortunately, not enough people know the history of the Nazis in their actions before World War II, when they transported people from Spain during the Spanish Revolution, and Dachau was the terminus. One of my jobs, well, most of my work, had to do with man-machine interfaces. And as such, I had a very close relationship with intelligence. And they sent me every piece of paper that came across their desks that had to do with medicine and atrocities and research. And as horrible as the camps were, the things that German scientists thought up in guise of research were even more horrible. Taking 20 people from newborn babies to older people and staking them out in the snow in the wintertime, going around every hour to collect the dead, to find out how long it took to freeze, and taking some of the survivors, throwing them in bed with whores to find out if that was the best way to bring these people back to life. Doctor, it's very difficult for me to talk about those days and all the information that came. I interviewed hundreds of physicians. I'm going to stop in just a minute. And the one thing that I learned was that the Germans were wonderful liars. When we took over a hospital in Brussels the day it was liberated and asked whether or not the troops had been inoculated with tetanus, of course, we have. And when we went through the wards, there were 10 cases of tetanus in the hospital. Just one of many examples. Were you at the trial of the doctors?
No, sir. No. I was in Nuremberg only for the first, and excuse the expression, the main trial of the originally 22 defendants. Now, after those trials, there were many others of the generals, the doctors, the judges, and of course, I mentioned only one example of Rudolf Höss. And you're talking actually about trials that followed. They were trials of the actual perpetrators. There was not a man in the first Nuremberg trial, probably with the exception of Goering, who personally had ever killed anybody. They just issued the orders to get it done. But it's in those subsequent trials. I went home to go to college and become an engineer. So I was not at the subsequent trials, but I'm well aware of the horrible things, that were covered. If I may, I would like to add just one word to your description of the horrible things that went on in reference to the German people or any people. Dictatorship and tyranny corrodes everything it touches.
Well, it certainly corroded the medical research establishment in Germany, and much to the
Doctor,
credit of the other scientists in Europe. They immediately ceased any sort of relationship with Germany the instant that the war broke out. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you.
Hi, this is sort of a personal question, so I hope you'll bear with me for just a second. My great-uncle was named Joseph Dano and was a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, and he died long before I was born, so I never got to speak to him about the experience, but I was wondering if maybe on the off chance you knew him?
Say the name again?
Joseph Dano?
D-A-N-O?
D-A-I-N-O-W.
Yeah, I think subsequent proceedings.
I'm sorry to say no.
Okay.
There were, when you include the other trials, there were literally hundreds, of prosecutors that followed on. The first trial was staffed by about 600 people, of whom perhaps 100 or so were prosecutors. We had, as I explained, interpreters, secretaries, stenographers, people in the documentation division. But I get this question, I have to tell you very frequently, did you know so-and-so, and even about interpreters? And I hate to tell you that most of the time I have to say no. I'm 81. I was then 22, and most of my contemporaries, if that's possible, are in a better place than we are here.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
A substantial number of Nazi war criminals did escape to Latin America. Could you comment on the role of the United States or United States government in allowing that to happen?
I tell you, in a way, that's like asking when did you stop beating your wife, because I'm not aware that the United States government or armed forces ever allowed it to happen. I think that many of the Germans managed to circumvent the rules and whatever and got there, and I know it's a fact that many did. I also know that there are some exaggerations, but some of the South American countries were very happy to have them. So I'm sorry I can't comment on that.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Sonnenfeldt, I'd like to thank you for reliving my life. Whereas I'm a year older than you are, I am way below at the Nuremberg trial as a translator to your position. I'd like to comment on the fact that you said everybody thought this was the last bad thing that Hitler did. My father wouldn't emigrate because he said it was his Germany and not Hitler's, and he was going to stay. I was very fortunate in finding my parents alive after the war, saved primarily by the colleague of Pastor Niemöller, who gave them, they had 13 people who hid them. Whenever they were denounced, somebody else took them, and I found them alive after the war.
Let me take a moment, if I may, and pay tribute to your father, and pay tribute to 10,000 or 20,000 Germans who did not support Hitler, who stayed in Germany, some in hiding, some with faith that something would come later, many of them at the risk of their lives hiding Jews. I had a distant cousin who was hidden during the entire war in Germany, and people say to me, only 10 or 20,000? Well, who of us would have done that? That's an enormous number. And I do want to pay tribute to those Germans who lived their faith and stayed there and outlived Hitler and proved that not all Germans were bad.
Doctor, I was wondering what was life like as a young boy in that environment when you were 8, 9, 10 years old?
Well, things changed gradually. In 1933, I was 10 years old, and we had to take a swim test, and I had just started secondary school, and I was the only boy of my age who dove off the high board, and everybody applauded until they realized it was the Jew boy, and it stopped suddenly. And over a period of years, I was very popular. I was a bit of a rowdy, had all the friends I wanted, and between the years 1933 and 1935, I lost all of my friends. And their parents didn't dare to have their children play with a Jewish child because their livelihood was threatened. I have to tell you, until I personally never experienced any violence or saw anybody getting killed, but it was very unpleasant. And I was abused in school by a rabid teacher. We don't have time to get into it. Well, I'll try and tell it as quickly as I can. The way you started a class in Germany normally was to say, Guten Morgen, good morning. And all of a sudden this teacher was a rabid Nazi, started the class by saying, excuse me, Heil Hitler. And I stood there and I didn't raise my arm. And the teacher says, I didn't see the Jew boy perform the Hitler greeting. And I said, teacher, I'm not allowed to, I'm a Jew. And he said, from here on in, before we start the class, you go outside and stand in the corner of the hall until we do our greeting. And they did, and then he sent somebody out and said in a loud voice, the Jew boy can come in now. And so it was petty chicanery, which really was very unpleasant. And the town where I lived was a town of 9,000, and there were only 10 or so Jewish families, 30 Jewish people, only 4 children, nobody quite my age, so I had no playmates. And I was sort of driven to learn hobbies, which I did. I learned how to make radios, and there was a shop, a Jewish man had a shop for a while. I learned how to fix motorcycles, and I was allowed to work in the carpentry shop. So it was like segregation without violence. Very unpleasant.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
In the war in Bosnia, Serbs killed neighbors. Very surprisingly, the neighbors were Muslims. The neighbors didn't also believe that this could possibly happen. What could have been different between your experience as a youth in Germany and what transpired in Bosnia? Why was it's so easy to sell anti-Semitism, anti-Russians, anti-Gypsy? And was there a similarity in neighbor versus neighbor, or neighbor with neighbor? Or
You're asking...
there's no one answer.
Well, I was going to say, you're asking a very difficult question. Let me say that in Germany, and I tried to explain it, one of the big components of anti-Semitism was the erroneous claim that communists led by Jews had stabbed the good Imperial German army in the back. That was a myth that was invented by Hindenburg, and Ludendorff was his chief of staff, and Germany was a very nationalistic country. And the idea that Germany had not really lost the war, but that traitors had stabbed it in the back, it was very appealing to a lot of people. So the Jews communists, but the Jews became the scapegoats. And, you know, there was a terrible depression in Germany. There was terrible unemployment. And I think people all over the world think when there's a terrible problem, somebody must be responsible for it. Somebody must have caused it. So Hitler managed to manipulate public opinion into believing that the Jews were the cause of the real problems that existed, you know, in Germany. Now, as far as Bosnia is concerned and others, I beg off. There must be people here who know better than I how that kind of hatred is manipulated. I have to tell you, being born in Europe, and there may be others here, beggaring thy neighbor and fighting and taking territory from your neighbor and hating your neighbor. If he looks different, speaks it different, has a different religion, it's the history of Europe. Fortunately, I think NATO and the European Union have made it a condition now for countries to forswear those ancient habits. And I don't believe for 1 minute that they vanished overnight, but I hope very much it's habit forming.
Gentlemen, we have time for 2 quick final questions. Sir?
As a boy during World War II, we were brought up with the notion that Hitler's prime objective was world conquest. This was always what we were told, that Hitler was out to conquer the world. Then many years later, I think Hannah Arendt wrote a book called The War Against the Jews, 1939 to 1945. In that book, she propounded the theory, or the thesis, that Hitler's #1 object was the destruction of the Jews, not world conquest. What would your comment be on that?
My answer has to have 2 parts. There is no question in my mind, from having read the records of Hitler's speeches, public and private and whatnot, that the destruction of the Jews was his goal. And we can now argue whether he was a psychopath or what caused that blind hatred, but there is not the slightest question that the destruction of the Jews was his goal, and
that
he
was
left
his prime object then.
Pardon?
His prime object, even more than world conquest.
Well, as far as the Jews are concerned, as far as world conquest is concerned, the way I read it is very different. He started out by wanting revenge for the Versailles Treaty, and at first, he only wanted to restore equality of the Germans. When he succeeded, beyond his wildest hopes, for instance, in the Rhineland, he was an embezzler who took $100 and wasn't caught, and then he became a megalomaniac. And there's a famous speech of his which says, "I have infinite trust in myself and the power of my intellect, and the generals are a bunch of dope." So what happened with regard to conquest? He became intoxicated by his success, and he had no knowledge of history, had absolutely no understanding of the vastness of Russia or the power of America if one's mobilized. He looked on the United States as a bunch of playboys, jazz-swinging civil rights, no idea at all. So his successes in Europe and the weakness of his early opponents and his ignorance of the rest of the world did him in.
One very fast question. There was also another book written called Hitler's Willing Executioners. At Nuremberg, were there others tried other than Germans? For example, in Romania, you had the equivalent of a Gestapo. Were there any other Europeans tried at Nuremberg other than Germans?
As far as I know, only Germans were tried at Nuremberg because the Allies, somewhat before the end of the war, decided that each criminal would be tried in the country in which he had committed the crime, with the sole exception of those where you couldn't localize the crime. And the people we had in Nuremberg had committed crimes all over Europe. So we had the collection of those, couldn't be localized. The man Huss, whom I mentioned, he was sent back to Poland and he was hung in Auschwitz, which was the camp that he ran. So as far as I now know, other nationals whose crimes may have been as bad, but had less geographic range, were tried and punished in the countries where the crime was committed.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to be here and listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, one last question.
If the Germans had won the war, did they ever confide in you directly, any of the defendants, as to what specific plans they next would have set?
The answer to that is clearly no, but I don't think they had any plans beyond. And I want to tell you that they dreamt about hooking up with the Japanese, either in the Mideast or in India, and they dreamt of dominating Europe, Asia, and probably Africa. I don't think that they ever thought that they could dominate the Western Hemisphere. And what happened is they didn't have that much time to think because they started getting defeated.
Thank you all very much.